Okay, so what is an archosauromorph? Well, g'day, it is Ken Colson here from Creation Unfolding. We have got Dr. Matt McLain back with us again, and we're going to be talking about something called archosauromorphs. Big word, but Dr. McLain is going to explain what those are. So, Matt, welcome back. Great to have you back again.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Oh, fantastic. Happy Thanksgiving.
Yes, you too. Although I know
So,
it's different in Australia.
a little bit different. We did have Thanksgiving. We had some Americans that invited us over here in Australia, a whole bunch of Americans talking about American stuff. So, and since I'm kind of like a bit of both, it was fun.
Yeah.
So it's good. So talking about archosauromorphs, I mean, I guess to start off with, what does that mean?
Well, Ken, I actually have a little PowerPoint here I can share that I think will answer our question on what is an archosauromorph. Let me put this up so you can see it. So Archosauromorpha is a big group of reptiles, okay?
Hmm?
And the group that some people would have heard of before is something called Archosauria. And Archosauria has two living groups that are called archosaurs in there. So there's crocodilians on the one hand. So that's like your traditional, alligators, crocodiles, gharials, those kinds of things. And then when you use cladistics or any kind of phylogeny or anything, they also put birds in this group. Now, we don't think of birds as reptiles, obviously, and I don't think birds evolved from other reptiles, just like I don't think crocodilians evolved from other reptiles. But they are considered kind of the two living examples of archosaurs. And then other animals that are close relatives of these would be fitting in here, things like dinosaurs and pterosaurs and stuff. But what a lot of people don't know is that there's a bigger group that contains Archosauria. So when we look at this chart right here, Archosauria is right here. So everything down here is an archosaur, all these different animals. But then there's all this stuff up here that is an archosauromorph, but not an archosaur. So it's all these other extinct reptiles. We have no living members of this group. They are really fascinating, kind of bizarre animals. I'll show you some in a minute. And the reason we're talking about archosauromorphs today is that we wanted to understand what kinds of created kinds there are here. And that whole study of created kinds is what we call baraminology.
Mm.
And I'm not going to go into great detail here about how it works. But basically, people often think of life as, I talked to a lot of creationists that kind of have this idea of like God created every animal exactly as it is today, right? And so we have here this little chart where these things look like individual blades of grass. You can see that, right? And so the idea is over time, it either continues to the present or it goes extinct, right? And that's the whole idea.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists over time recognized, hey, that's not accurate because for instance, dogs and wolves and coyotes, they're descending from a common ancestor, right? They can interbreed, and we think that they did come from a common ancestor. And so that's where Darwin jumped in with his tree of life, right? So instead of having these individual species that go all the way back to creation, Darwin imagines that there's one type of organism, and from that come all the different living things, everything from trees to dogs to mushrooms to people, right? And that's obviously not right because that disagrees with the Bible, or we know this to be true. And
Right.
so baraminology comes in and says, well, hold on, maybe it's a little bit of both, right? There are distinct created kinds that God makes at the creation week, right? But those individual created kinds can diversify. So you might have a dog family tree here, right? Where you get coyotes and dogs and wolves and foxes and dingoes and all these things coming from a single ancestor, right? You might have a cat tree over here where you get lions and tigers and house cats and jaguars and all those things coming from a single cat ancestor. And so we would believe in limited diversification. And you've talked about this before on your channel. That's a thing that people will be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
So because of that, people, creationists, scientists want to know, okay, well, what are the limits to the created kind, right? So when we think about, cats, for instance, it's like, okay, are saber-toothed cats in the same created kind as other cats? Are hyenas in this kind? Like, where do we draw the lines between these things? And so that's what we try and figure out in baromenology. And obviously, with modern animals, you can breed them and stuff, but even then, that's not a for sure signal, right? If they can't interbreed, there might be some other reason why they don't. And you obviously can't do that with fossil animals. And so that's where we develop these methods. And when you read baromenology papers or hear baromenology presentations, you'll see these charts that look like this, and they look really confusing. But the big thing you're looking at with these charts, and we're not going to look at a lot of these, I just wanted to show you kind of what the charts look like. Um, you can see there's clusters, right? So there's like the blue guys over here and the red ones over there. So the blue ones here are one type of animal, in this case called pariasaurs, and over here we have things that aren't pariasaurs. And the fact that they're not all clustered together in one clump, hey, that's cool, right? That's what I'd expect, is that there's two separate clusters here. One that's the animal, the kind potentially, and then we have another one over there that's other stuff, right?
Right.
And you can see the same thing here. You got a cluster and a cluster. So that's kind of what we're looking at, using clustering methods to kind of figure out statistically, where is there significant similarity versus dissimilarity? And that's what we'd expect to see, right? This idea of created kinds, that all these guys in here would be more similar to each other than any of them would be to somebody in this tree, is kind of the idea, or in that tree. And so we want to do this for Archosauromorphs. We want to find out, okay, what do we know? What can this tell us about what God originally made? What can this tell us about what went in the ark? There's a lot of different questions that this could potentially answer, and it helps us understand the ecosystems of the past too. How did they diversify in the pre-flood world? So anytime you start a study, right, and we presented this at the International Conference on Creationism this year, and I did this with research with four of my undergrad students at Masters University. And anytime you do this kind of research, you got to go back and say, okay, what did somebody else do in the past, right? You always have to do this kind of thing. What do we already know? And so when you put up this big tree of all these different Archosauromorphs, it turns out there's one non-Archosauromorph group that's been looked at before. And I was involved in that. Everything else is crocodilians or pterosaurs or dinosaurs and birds. Those are all things that are cladistically considered archosaurs. So that means that this whole chunk up here has never been investigated.
Is this
No
from a
one's ever looked at this.
creationist perspective?
Creationist perspective. Yeah, no one has
Yeah.
ever looked at these from a created kinds perspective. No one's ever
Right.
tried to figure out what are the kinds, right? And you'll notice there's whole groups here that are missing too, right? That no one's ever looked at. And so we said, great, this is something we can investigate and learn, right? And this is a giant group of things, right? We're expecting lots of different created kinds in here. We're not just expecting these to all be one created kind. And what's really interesting, when you look at the history of this research, back before there was phylogenetics, before there was cladistics, and people were discovering these things and putting them in groups and stuff, there appeared these kind of recognizable units. And, nobody needs to read all the names on this chart. I want you to look at the colors, right? So here you've got a big phylogeny, and it's been color coded, where the major groups are different colors, right? So rhynchosaurs are yellow right here, and erythroseuchids are orange, and proterosuchids are red. So you can see these colors. Different people generate different phylogenies, right? And they don't always agree. They use different character sets.
Can I just stop there just briefly?
Sure.
So just for the audience, when you're looking at this phylogeny, what's called a phylogeny, it looks like a tree. And it's basically an evolutionary perspective on how we get all the different critters that we see in the fossil record and today. And so when you see the tree splitting into different branches, you're basically getting different groups of individuals. Is there anything you can add to that that would just help?
Yeah, no, I mean that's great. What you're seeing, right, is each one of these branches off of here, these are going to be, clades, right? They're going to be these groups that come off. And this is an evolutionary diagram, right? That's what's published on these things. They're mainly discussed in the evolutionary literature. Not many creationists have worked on them. And what's really interesting is if you talk to, 5 different evolutionary paleontologists, they'll have 5 different phylogenies, right? Everyone's got their own particular way they think these things evolved and they're related
Right.
to each other. But the units stay together, right? So for instance, our yellow group here, rhynchosaurs, some people
Right.
put them right here, some people put them higher up here, some people put them lower down here. But no one splits apart the rhynchosaurs,
Yeah.
right? Rhynchosaurs
So,
always stay together.
so the groups
Okay.
can sort of, from an evolutionary perspective, the groups can get swapped around
Hmm.
depending on where the particular, secular author thinks they fit in the evolutionary tree.
Right.
Right.
Yep.
Okay.
And the thing is, even before there was phylogenies and cladograms and stuff, back when people were still doing, basic Linnaean taxonomy, the kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species thing, these groups would still stay together. So I showed you the yellow one, Rhynchosaurs here. Way back in the day, people thought they were actually relatives of the Tuatara and closer to things like lizards. And now we recognize them as Archosauromorphs. They're closer to crocodiles. But what's interesting is, once again, you never split apart the rhynchosaurs. It wasn't like, oh, some rhynchosaurs are like tuatars and some rhynchosaurs are like crocodiles. No, rhynchosaurs are rhynchosaurs. Like it's like a one group thing. And so
Yeah.
we're looking at this as creationists, looking at this evolutionary tree, and we're saying, huh, there's like these individual little modules here, right? These different little groups. And people disagree on how the groups are related to each other, but everyone seems to basically agree on what belongs in the group. There's a few things that are a little confusing, but for the most part, the groups are pretty clear. And
Mm-hmm.
so we're looking at that and we're saying, wow, that sounds a lot like created kinds,
Mm-hmm.
right? It sounds like you're seeing each one of these, we might predict would be a group that has continuity and is surrounded by discontinuity, right? It's a group that everything in it belongs to the kind and it's actually separate from the other kinds. And
Mm-hmm.
so we could predict, looking at this phylogeny here, this evolutionary tree, we might predict that every one of these colors is a different kind, a different created kind.
Mm-hmm.
And there may be some exceptions. For instance, like our blue group there might actually be made of multiple ones, or maybe, red and orange are actually one kind together. And we can look at that and explore it. But the point is that these different recognizable units, yeah, that sounds a lot like what a creationist would predict. And that's why we got really excited about this and we wanted to investigate it. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to say, can you take this big evolutionary tree and split it up into chunks and they actually make sense as created kinds?
Okay.
Um, because the evolutionist says, no, the only way you can explain these animals is with an evolutionary tree, right? And that's
Okay.
what we want to look at. And so before we do that, I just want to show you some of the animals, so you can kind of see some of the animals we're looking at. And this is fun because we get to see aspects of God's glory that are hidden for most
Yeah.
people, right?
And just for the audience again, a lot of these groups, you don't even see them really in a lot of nature programs, right? We see
Oh,
dinosaurs
yeah.
and those kinds of things, but these groups, I mean, obviously from a creationist perspective, they haven't been studied a lot. But even in the secular world, people just, don't even know they exist.
Yeah, yeah.
So this is fun
Um,
that we
it
get to
is, it
look
is
at
really
these
fun.
groups from a creationist perspective that a lot of people haven't even heard of.
Yes. And that's why I always enjoy this aspect. And this is why I like teaching these things in school. It's like, I get exposed students to all these things that God made, and they're just like, really, that's real? Like that actually existed? And yeah, it did. And our first example is exactly that kind of thing. These are Tanystrophiids and Dinocephalosaurids. These animals have super, super long necks, like really, really long necks compared to their bodies. To the point that you look at that and you're like, man, what could that walk? What did it do? And it turns out a lot of these are aquatic animals. And actually, some of them have been found to have had given birth to live young, that they were not laying eggs, which is something you see in a lot of aquatic reptiles. And so that's a really cool, just very surprising animal to see, and very different than our next thing, right?
Well,
These
just
guys
just
are,
before you go
yeah,
back
yeah, I go
again.
back.
So I mean, just looking at you look at that, and the first thing that comes to my mind is a sauropod,
Yeah, yeah,
right? So obviously, this is not a sauropod.
no,
It's got nothing to do with sauropods.
nope.
But how big is this creature?
Yeah, good question. So they can be small. You can be thinking about things like, big lizard size, but they can get up to 10, 12, 15 feet long. So they
Okay.
can
All
be
right.
good sized animals too.
Yeah.
But they're nowhere compared to like a big sauropod dinosaur, right? These are,
Yeah.
and you'll notice like the legs are kind of sprawling legs, right? So they're not like, these big colossal animals like you're used to thinking about with the
Right.
sauropods.
Right.
Yeah. And okay, so we got these guys. These guys are just wild, right? You got guys with horns on their heads. You got this thing that looks like a Dr. Seuss creature, or maybe something from the Dark Crystal. I don't know. But and then you've got yeah, there's just unusual things. Allocutosaurs, other lizards, basically. They're just really weird animals. And they are mainly herbivores, although some of them were carnivorous too, we think. And they typically have very good claws for either climbing or digging. You can see like the really robust claws on all those guys.
Mm,
And these guys, once again, some of them are pretty small, an iguana kind of size thing. Some of them could be, larger, something that you might think of like a big Komodo dragon or something like that.
right.
Um, and then we got these guys. They got a beak. These are called rhynchosaurs. I mentioned them a few times before, that yellow group. You can see this beak kind of thing going on. They've got some really weird teeth kind of things going on in their mouth too. These
Looks
are
like a
these are plant
beaver.
eaters. It looks like a beaver, doesn't it? And I wonder, did they try and chop down trees? I don't know. But they're very, very common animals. So these are in the Triassic. Pretty much everything we're looking at, by the way, is Triassic. I should have mentioned that
So
before.
these are all
Um,
dinosaur aged, aged rocks from a
yeah.
secular perspective.
Yeah, so these things are either in rocks just before you get dinosaurs, or they're in rocks at the same time as your first dinosaurs you find in the fossil record, and where dinosaurs are not very common. So for instance, there are places in South America where you find fossils of these guys, rhynchosaurs, where there's just everywhere, tons of these things, and there might only just be a handful of dinosaurs that they find there. They were the dominant herbivores in a lot of these ancient ecosystems.
Now, would
And
that be because the dinosaurs just lived somewhere else?
that's one of the questions we want to try and answer, right? Is figuring out, okay, as the more we understand the animals, that helps us understand the ecosystems, and then we can try and figure out what that means from a flood perspective. And so
Mm,
that's one of our goals, is to try and piece that together. And yeah, my suspicion is that this was a different ecosystem than where most of your dinosaurs lived in the pre-flood world. A different kind of thing going on. Just like today, you have elephants in some places and not in other places. I mean, it'd be kind of a similar situation.
yeah.
Um, and we got proterosuchids and erythrosuchids. So these guys are carnivorous forms. They're all Triassic also. You can see this is not a mistake in the fossil. All the proterosuchids we have, they have this downturned thing going on in the front of their face.
Wow.
Like the front of their snout just tips down like that. And the idea, we think, is that that creates a good trap, right? So if you bite something and you've got teeth pointing in like this, it can't escape, right? Like it can't wiggle out of there very well.
Right.
But even more interesting in some ways are your erythrosuchids. So look at the size of the head of this
Mm,
animal. That's not just an artistic depiction. They had really giant heads. You
mm.
kind of think of them as like bulldogs, and they're big, probably the hyper carnivores. They're the apex predators of these environments. You look at this skull, it looks like a big meat-eating dinosaur skull, right? It looks
Yeah.
like a T-Rex or an Allosaurus or something like that. But you look at the rest of the body and you're like, okay, that is definitely not an Allosaurus, right? Or a T-Rex. And they would have just been really, really massive, big things you would not want to mess with, basically. Would have been really scary to run into one of these in real life. So you can see there's your scale bar. That's 10 centimeters right there. So imagine how big of a skull you're talking about there, like half a meter or
Okay.
more.
So okay. Yeah. Right.
A big animal. Yeah. Um, these guys are protocampsians. They kind of look like crocodiles at first glance. And this is one of those where you kind of need to know your anatomy really well to recognize them not as crocodiles. There's lots of little tiny features here and there. But some of them are very unique. So this is Van Clevia right here. This animal has a really short snout. It's very difficult to figure out who it's related to. They put it in this group, but it might not really be here. It's known from petrified forest. You find it some other places in the southwestern United States. And it's like a little guy. I mean, its head's like maybe this big, and it's got armor all along it. It's just a very unique little creature that doesn't seem to have clear relatives from what we know of fossils right now. Um, And then we get phytosaurs, and I've worked on these a lot with students in the past. These look a lot like crocodiles. The easy way to tell them apart is where the nose is. So in a crocodile, your nostrils should be up here, right, on the tip of the snout. But instead, they're way up here, close to the eyes. They're typically on a big bump. You can see the bump on this guy's head. So they're in the wrong place. There's obviously lots of other features you can use to differentiate them too, but that's the really easy one to see.
Hmm.
And these are big animals. You can see a person right there. These could be very massive, scary things to run into. And hopefully, if you keep following stuff that I do in the future, there should be lots of phytosaur stuff coming out.
Hmm.
They're really very interesting animals. We're starting to learn more and more about both, secular science and in creation science. They are one of the things we're looking at here. And then once we get to Archosauria, you've got your things more like crocodiles and your things that are supposedly more like birds. So the ones that are more like crocodiles will be this group called Pseudotsuchia. And this includes all kinds of fun things. This guy's Simosuchus. He's called the pug-nosed crocodile. This is actually an exhibit at the Ark Encounter that I've got a photograph of here. So if you go visit the Ark Encounter in Kentucky, that's where my Answers in Genesis, they've got two little Simosuchus models in there. And these things are like lapdog sized, and that's the full grown size of this. Really interesting little animal. They're probably omnivores. They got really like smashed in faces. Look at their tails, super short, right? And totally encased in armor, almost looks like an ice cream cone at the end there. Yeah, really, really interesting. Nothing like a crocodile today, right? I'd be really shocked if this isn't the same created kind as a crocodile. It's a very different functioning animal in every way you can imagine. Here's an Adasaur. These are cool ones from the Triassic. So Simosuchus is not from the Triassic. He's actually Cretaceous. These guys are Triassic, though. They got lots of armor on them, really thick, bony armor with spikes and things. And they got good sizes, too. You can see there. This guy is really goofy looking. He's got a beak, no teeth at all in his mouth. He's got a fin on his back, like a big sail, like if you remember Spinosaurus or Dimetrodon, one of those animals. And he's a good sized animal. I mean, like kind of like a
So
big
these
cow.
animals, I mean, the three that we're looking at all look very different.
Yeah.
So why is it that an evolutionist puts them in the same group?
Yeah. So, this group I'm showing you here, Pseudotsuchia, it's not like the other ones we looked at where it's like, oh, every rhynchosaur has the same body plan. This would include lots of different body plans, right? So this is a really big group, just like you might say mammal, right? Or
Okay,
something like that. But one of the things that would unite all these animals, one of the easy things you can point out quickly is their ankles. So a dinosaur or a bird ankle is just a simple hinge. I'm obviously doing a wrist because I don't want to stick my foot up here, but basically it just goes like that.
right,
Whereas a crocodile ankle, it's got this kind of convoluted, like kind of a zigzag pattern, and the two tarsals kind of move past each other. And so it has this really weird rotation that happens with the ankle. And so all these animals have that. There'd be lots of other features too they share in common, but yes, they're very, very different types of animals, right?
right.
We would expect there to be multiple created kinds in here as we're
Hmm.
looking at it. And then we have our supposedly bird line group. So this would include your dinosaurs down here. This would include your pterosaurs, your flying reptiles. There's other things in here too, like this little guy, Scleromochlus, who's one of these Lagurpitids. They're really tiny little long-legged guys that are kind of dinosaurian looking, and they're uniquely Triassic as well. So you're already looking at this and you're recognizing, okay, there's lots of different types of things in here. I don't think that this isn't the same created kind as a pterodactyl or a triceratops, right? These
Right.
are different things. So what we did is we did baromenological analyses, all these statistical analyses on all these animals, right? On this giant phylogeny, we broke it up into chunks and looked at all different chunks and did 5 or 6 different methods on each chunk and big chunks and little chunks and all kinds of stuff, just trying to figure out what does it all mean, trying to see all the patterns in the data. And essentially what we came up with was that we say here discontinuity is abundant in these animals. What we mean is that it's not just a big spectrum, right? Evolution, the way evolution thinks is like, basically you would have, imagine the tree of life, right? Slowly and gradually turning one thing into another thing. Okay. And even if you have something like what Stephen Jay Gould talks about, punctuated equilibrium, right? We have like these sudden changes. those are still, you should still be able to imagine continuity connecting all these things, right? And that's not what we find. We find that there's actually, when you start looking at it, there's really clear divisions between living things. And the traditionally recognized groups, when somebody says Rhynchosaur or Phytosaur, those groups look real. Like they look like those are the groups where you do see continuity inside them, and they look like they're separate from everybody else. They're discontinuous from everybody else. And so that really sounds like a created kind.
Mm.
And so we identified potentially about 16 different created kinds of these Archosauromorphs. And these are just Triassic ones. We weren't looking at anything beyond the Triassic. And we found, and these are silhouettes of all the guys down there, 16 different ones. And there could be more, there could be a little bit less. You know, this is how science works, right? You refine things over time. But that's really cool that, you know, we're looking at this group and we're saying, hey, we expect that there should be, you know, at least a dozen of these things. And sure enough, when we do the analyses, we get a dozen or a little bit more, right? And that's cool on the one hand that, hey, this is kind of giving us some confidence that we can look at work that evolutionists have done and see these things and say, hey, I recognize some individual little groups here. I bet these might be created kinds. On the flip side, what it also does for us is it helps us start thinking about things like, okay, how many animals do need to go on the ark, right? It helps us think through things like, okay, are there different types of ecosystems, right? So you were asking before about, okay, are dinosaurs just not living with these guys? Are they living in other places? You know, so you look at these types of ecosystems where you only get these types of animals. You know, you might get different ones in South America that you get in Africa, but it's the same categories of animals that you get in both, right? So for instance, I'll try and find a good example here. You know, we've got our rhynchosaurs right here. So, you know, you have rhynchosaurs in South America, like Hyperdapodon. You've got some in Europe, like Bentonix. You know, they're different genera, different species, but they're both the same kind, right? And so, yeah, if I find that animal, I'd expect to find the other kinds around it, different species, because they're in two different places in the world, but that's telling me something about a pre-flood ecosystem, right? There was a community structure to it. Like if you stepped into this ecosystem, regardless of what part of the world you were in, you'd expect to find rhynchosaurs there, and you'd expect to find, you know, Browasuchians there, and all these different kinds of animals that would be grouping around there. And so that's really cool because that's helping us, you know. And so, like I said, the art kinds, you know, great example. Let's look at phytosaurs right here. So there's like over 20 different phytosaur species that have been named. There's considered more than that. And that may mean that only two of those animals actually went on the ark, right? And so that helps us thinking through, okay, we don't have to make room for all 20 of these, right? We can just imagine two of these. And so there's lots of different applications as we think through these things, but the biggest application really is this is a wide, big picture view at things. We need people to go in and dive in the little nitty-gritty things, right? We just don't have enough creationists really looking at all these different creatures. And this is where there's just tons of research opportunities. And this is what I tell students all the time, you know, is there work to do as creationists? Absolutely, right? You can explore any particular corner of God's creation, and there's so much to learn. And there's a lot of it that you can write on and do that's would be all pretty much similar to what a secular scientist is doing, right? But then there'd be other things that will be uniquely creations, where you would bring a very particular perspective to the table and you can offer something that other people wouldn't be thinking of. And that's exciting. And so, you know, if you didn't catch any of this and you're like, you know, you're getting bored talking about weird reptiles or things like that, listen, big picture, think about this here. We are seeing these aspects of God's creation. God made these things, and we know very little about them. And so the more we invest in this, the more we get to see God's glory on display, and the better we understand the world that he made.
Excellent. So, yeah, I mean, Dr. McLain is a professor, of course, at the Masters University, and he's teaching paleontology and geology, paleobiology as well. So for anyone out there, if you're interested in this kind of stuff, as you should be, then, you know, get hold of Dr. McLain. You can find his email address online by going to TMU or just doing a Google search for it, and you'll be able to, you know, answer any questions that you have regarding the school if you wanted to sort of get into this kind of thing. I mean, there's not many creationists that are involved in paleontology, which is why we're sort of short research-wise, right? But
Yeah.
I think, thankfully, we actually have a budding group of young paleontologists right now that are out there actively doing research, and I'm sure that that's going to grow in the next few years. So we'll see a lot of good stuff coming up in the next few decades, I'm sure. So if you're interested, go ahead and contact Dr. McLain from the Masters University. Okay, so I think that's about it here, Matt. I think we covered the gamut on Archosauromorphs. So that was exceptionally interesting. These are creatures that, as I said, are really not well understood. I mean, from a popular perspective, a lot of people don't know about them.
Yeah.
So it's a good opportunity for us as creationists to be able to delve into them a little bit. So we appreciate that. Thank you. Okay, so well, that's all from me. Again, Ken Colson here at Creation Unfolding. So look, if you were in any way blessed by this video, then go ahead and pound that like button. I'd really appreciate that. There is a link in the description if you feel like giving. That would be great too. As always, spend a moment and pray for me. I appreciate that. And we will see you next time. Thank you. Goodbye.